In chapter 12, we read about Abram's heeding the call of God to uproot himself and go to the promised land. In the first part of the chapter, we see how Abram indeed performs the command. We see his commitment and sacrifice, and really uprooting himself and going to the unknown, totally new land. Today, we'll deal with the second part of chapter 12, this famous story of Abram and Sarai going down to Egypt. This is the first of actually three examples of what is termed the wife-sister narratives, in which the patriarch presents his wife as his sister, the other two being a second one with Abraham in chapter 20 when he goes down to the land of Gerar and Avimelech, and the third one with Isaac presenting Rebekah as his sister once again in Gerar with King Avimelech. A central question is that much of modern biblical scholarship grapples with is the relationship between the different wife-sister episodes. And of course, this plays a very central role in biblical criticism. But this lecture is not the appropriate place to grapple with it. It's preferable to deal with a comparison between the different episodes later on as we progress, when we reach the second case, so forth. In this lecture, we'll focus on the first case of the wife-sister, namely, once again, chapter 12, and try to understand it in and of itself. A different opportunity, we can also deal with the comparison between the different wife-sister narratives. So the story, like I said, is of course well known, but it's important to refresh our memories. So I'll ask you to read the text before continuing on with the lecture, and I will share with you the text itself in translation right away. And as you read it, please pay attention to the following four questions. Remember them. What are the two challenges facing Abraham in the story? How does he face these challenges? Does he succeed in overcoming the challenges? And most importantly, invest some thought regarding what is your opinion about Abraham's behavior in this story. Okay, so I suggest you reread the story. Here I'll leave it on in English translation, and consider the four questions. What are the challenges facing Abraham? How does he face them? And is he successful in facing them? And finally, what's your opinion about how he grapples with these challenges? Okay, now that you have read the story, you certainly notice that there are two challenges facing Abraham in this narrative. The first is the famine, a well-known and repeating motif throughout the Bible. Famine facing the patriarch who reaches the promised land. And of course, this is quite a big challenge, because Abraham uprooted himself from a successful career apparently in Haran, where he made it big time and became affluent. And he follows the call of God. And then what does he find when he reaches the promised land? He gets to Shechem. God tells him, this is the land that I will give to you and your offspring. And then he continues going down to Bethel, between Bethel and the Ai, and finally going down south. But there is a famine, and that's how we open up the story. That is the first challenge facing Abraham. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So it's not just any famine, it's a severe famine. The unfortunate Abraham, who uprooted himself from a land of plenty, and in light of the promise that God gave him, he will be with him and bless him, and he'll be a blessing. And what does he find when he follows the word of God? A big challenge, which apparently involves also quite a bit of suffering. And therefore, he decides that he has no choice but to go down to Egypt. And that is the first challenge that Abraham faces. Of course, it is not the only one, because approaching Egypt raises another challenge. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So the second challenge facing Abraham is that he has a pretty wife. That's a challenge that a lot of people wouldn't mind having, but in this instance, it's pretty problematic and can even risk Abraham's life because apparently, at least this is Abraham's concern, this could lead to people wanting his wife and therefore killing him. So the first challenge is a famine. And in times of famine, which were most probably caused by lack of rain, so the closest place to get food was in Egypt, because of course Egypt is not dependent upon rain. It has its supply of irrigation via the Nile River, which drains the tropical rains in tropical Africa. So he goes down there, and now he's scared for his life for a different reason, not because of famine, but because of the beauty of his wife. So his solution is, of course, to ask Sarai to present herself as his sister. Now, if we look closely in the text, we see that there are two reasons for this request. And this is very interesting and maybe even quite surprising. Say you are my sister, one, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and two, and my life will be spared because of you. Now, the second reason seems to be the primary one, to save his life, but there's something added, so that I will be treated well for your sake. This is a translation of the Hebrew. We'll emphasize it here. Leman, here we see right here. Leman yitavli ba'avurech, v'chayta nafshi biglalech. So, leman yitavli ba'avurech, in Hebrew, was translated so I'd be treated well, right? Treated well for your sake. It's not a clear and definite translation. Yitavli, the word tov, things will be good. Maybe I would translate so that I could profit. Yitavli, I will be able to profit. Ba'avurech. Now, ba'avurech could be translated in two ways. In this translation, and in most that I saw, it's translated as I will, for your sake, on your behalf, ba'avurech. That's the normal usage of the word ba'avur in Hebrew, but it's not the only one in the Bible. Sometimes ba'avurech is not for your sake, for your purpose, but rather because of you. And this may, in my mind, be the meaning here. So I will benefit because of you. That's how I think maybe more appropriate to translate, even though it's probably more difficult from a moral perspective. In other words, Abraham's telling Sarah, present yourself as my sister so that I can profit because of you. And also, I'll save my life. As opposed to the present translation that says, I will be treated well for your sake. And he's doing it all for Sarai. It's not clear. That's not definitely the meaning of Avrech. It could be because of you, not on your behalf, for your sake, but rather because of you. But that's open. In any event, it's clear that there are two reasons given, and this is the request that Abraham makes to Sarai in order to save his life. So, as far as facing the challenges, Abraham faced the challenge of famine by going down to Egypt, and he faced the challenge of danger to his life by presenting Sarai as his sister. Did he manage? Was he successful in overcoming the challenges? So if you'd ask the vast majority of readers, I think would say yes, definitely so, because as we know at the end, he gets out of Egypt and he has great wealth. So he survived the famine and they didn't kill him and everything's fine. There's a happy ending. So it seems like Abraham's plan was quite smart and he managed to successfully overcome the challenges facing him. Of course, that leaves question marks with regard to how do we evaluate um, the plot of Abraham and how he behaved, and we'll get to that shortly. But let us first just continue reading on and see how things progressed. So when Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, but I guess she stood out because of her beauty, and apparently that is something that goes very much noticed in Egypt. By the way, interestingly enough, even to this day in modern times, there's some interesting YouTubes. A certain Egyptian man dressed himself as an attractive woman and followed with a camera just to show what pretty Egyptian women go through when walking down the streets of Cairo. And there were also a couple of unfortunate incidents, even one of an American reporter who was attacked when she was covering the upheavals that took place in Egypt in the previous decade. So apparently certain things continue on from ancient times to the modern times. So in any event, Sarai is immediately noticed. Not only is she noticed by the average Egyptian, but, and in the next verse, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, the ministers of Pharaoh, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. And he treated Abraham well. Of course, this connects with what Abraham asked, right? Sarai, so that I will be treated well. So apparently everything's running as planned. That's exactly what happened. He treated Abraham well, right? In Hebrew, Vaitav, in Hebrew. Abraham heitiv ba'avura. So for Abraham, he benefited, I would say, because of her, not, like I said, not on her behalf, right, or for her behalf, but rather heitiv ba'avura, because of her, he benefited. I think that would be the better translation. All right. So he treated Abraham well, or Abraham benefited. I think it's a better translation because of her. And Abraham acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Camels, of course, being something representative of great wealth in those early times. So far, it seems like everything is running as planned. But we continue the story, and then there is, of course, a twist, because Abraham just lost his wife, or maybe that was his plan, to sell off his wife, sister, right, in order to profit. But now he finds himself without his wife. Next stage, enters the story, of course, God. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. Now, it's not exactly clear how Pharaoh understood what happened, but the text clearly insinuates that Pharaoh understood, or at least was very suspicious of things, and I guess made a connection between all those plagues inflicted negaim, right, in the Hebrew, Vainaga Hashem et Paro negaim gdolim. So there's afflictions or upon the house. Here it's translated diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Note, 3 questions does the Pharaoh ask Abraham. What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her to be my wife. After so many questions, our expectation is to hear the answer. But look, as we continue on reading, now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Interesting. Pharaoh asked 3 questions, no answer. It's not only that Abraham doesn't give an answer here, he doesn't seem to have the opportunity, because right away it's followed after the 3rd question. Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Very peculiar. Why does Pharaoh ask 3 questions, not allowing an answer to be given? In my humble opinion, the reason for this is because Pharaoh very well knows the answers to these questions. He's maybe playing it offended, but he fully is aware why Abraham did what he did. And hence, he doesn't need to hear the answer. And look at the continuation of the story, the conclusion. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abraham to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So Pharaoh basically expels Abraham and Sarai. Is this done? And everything he had, by the way, notice, Pharaoh does not take back all the gifts that he gave to Abraham, right? So it's interesting. Not only does Pharaoh not punish Abraham, you'd expect, okay, you lied to me, the Pharaoh would kill Abraham. But not only does the Pharaoh not do that, but he lets Abraham keep all the gifts that were given, but he does expel Abraham. But what's peculiar is, and that's what's usually understood. So Pharaoh's angry and he says, I don't no longer leave you the right to remain in my land, and therefore he expels them. But what is slightly peculiar is that in order to expel them, it says that he basically gives orders, I guess, to his soldiers to expel Abraham. Is that what's going on here? Does Pharaoh need to make sure that Abraham leaves with soldiers enforcing that departure? In other words, had the soldiers not been commanded to escort Abraham, is Pharaoh concerned that maybe Abraham would not leave? Hard to imagine. If anybody disobey a command of Pharaoh to leave the land, that's clearly suicide. So what's the purpose of those men, soldiers, escorting Abraham? So I want to answer that question, going back to our previous question about the 3 interrogations that Pharaoh raised vis-a-vis Abraham, not waiting for the answer. My claim was that Pharaoh knows the answer, and he is fully aware that Abraham's life is indeed in danger. People notice Sarai's beauty, and that could jeopardize Abraham's life. And that is the reason, in my opinion, that Pharaoh sends men to not to expel Abraham, but rather to secure and escort him safely out of Egypt. Because now, once word is out that Sarai is Abraham's wife and not sister, Pharaoh knows that Abraham's life isn't really in danger. And after having already experienced what happens when somebody meddles with Sarai, the wife of Abraham, and the plagues that were inflicted, the diseases that were inflicted upon his house, he no longer wants to take any chances, and therefore he wants to escort Abraham and Sarai safely out of there. He doesn't want to risk himself not punishing Abraham, because he's already noticed that apparently Abraham has some friends in high places, right? Not somebody to mess around with. And he doesn't want anybody else from his people to mess around with Abraham and Sarai, and therefore he escorts them safely out. Okay, so it looks like a simple and happy story. God looks after the patriarch, is guarding him and fulfilling the promises, and brings him safely and with riches out of Egypt as they return to the promised land. But when we reach our 4th question, which I ask you to contemplate, what is your opinion about Abraham's behavior here? there are clearly certain questions that arise, right? How do we appreciate Abraham's behavior in this story? And I think 2 points have to be considered here. The first, each one with regard to the two challenges that Abraham was facing. He said the first challenge was how to grapple with the famine, and Abraham's reaction was to go to Egypt. What's our opinion about that response? Is that what we expect from the patriarch? We noticed his tremendous faith and sacrifice and commitment, his readiness to uproot himself and follow the word of God to an unknown land, to a new land. And with all that faith and commitment and sacrifice, what do we see? He reaches the promised land. Things get a little difficult. And what's the reaction? What's the solution? Egypt, right? We leave the promised land. Is that what was expected from Abraham? So that's one thing to contemplate, right? Is that the right move that we would expect from the patriarch? So on the one hand, we can say, hey, there's no option here. What do you want? There's a famine. There's nothing to eat. So what's the patriarch to do? You can't count on a miracle. There's no food. There's nothing to buy. And the text did emphasize that this was a heavy famine in the beginning of the story, not just any famine. It's probably nothing to buy, right? No food. On the flip side, maybe somebody who has a promise from God to look after him, perhaps he should have enough faith that God will help him. So that's one question that may be raised. Did Abraham fail the test here? Maybe God was testing him to see how much faith do you have? Will you stick it out in the promised land even when things get tough, or will you leave? Question mark. We've seen other cases in which the patriarchs left. Sometimes they left the promised land, as the case of Jacob. Sometimes they didn't, like Isaac, who remained. In this instance, Abraham leaves and goes to Egypt. So that's one question. But even if you say, in light of the circumstances of a heavy famine, it's understandable that a person has to go where there's food. You can't just count on miracles. There's, of course, the second question, and that is how he treats Sarai. He's basically selling her off, right? Now, this slightly depends on our translation. How do we understand the Hebrew? Is it for your sake, like the most English translations adopt? And I think that's just to make things a little more palatable, right, and understandable. Or if we read it so that I can profit because of you, things don't look too good here. He's basically, the plan was to sell Sarai in order to profit from that and make it big time. So that I profit from because of you. And then it says, and Abraham indeed profited, benefited, right? Was treated well, right? But not on her behalf. I think more probably because of her, right? And he got all that wealth. Now, how do we relate to that? So once again, one may ask, hey, what do you want him to do? His life is in danger. And we'll emphasize, he asked Sarai, are you willing? He asked her, please present yourself as my sister, Imrina, right? The word na may be reflective of a request. Will you be so kind as and willing to present yourself as my sister? So he's asked, and she agrees. Maybe had she disagreed, so Abraham wouldn't have forced her to do so. So that may be somewhat to his benefit, but still, even the request itself, doesn't it raise some questions, right? Sometimes I ask my students, what's your opinion? Especially the female students are very interested, and some of them are understandable. Sure, I'd do anything to save my husband and I'd be willing to do it. But others say, listen, no, what? I expect my husband to stand up for me, defend me. And even if that involves risking his life, that's what I expect. So I guess it depends on one's attitude here. That's from the wife's perspective. But what about us as readers? How do we relate to the patriarch doing such a thing? Now, most people say, hey, it's Abraham, and it's clear that God came, to his help. So obviously God views Abraham very positively, and it seems like he comes to his help, and therefore there's no reason to critique. Did God critique Abraham in the story? Was there any rebuke? Doesn't seem to be when we read the story. But I want to share with you a very surprising commentary by a middle-aged Jewish commentator, Ramban, known in English as Nachmanides. He lived in the 13th century, was originally from Spain, Catalonia area, and very interesting character. And he participated actually in some disputations with Christians in Spain, and apparently did too well for his own safety. He himself, his life was endangered, just like the patriarch in our story, and he has to flee. And interestingly enough, he eventually makes it to Israel. We're talking, a very early period in the 13th century, and he moves to Israel. Actually, sets up a synagogue in Jerusalem, and also up to Akko, and a very interesting character and one of the most brilliant of the rabbis. And he has a phenomenal interpretation here. Let's read it together. I translated it as my own translation. Maybe I didn't find available on the internet an English translation. So I bring it to you in English, in my own English. He says as follows: know that our father Abraham sinned a great sin unintentionally by leading his righteous wife to a sinful predicament due to his fear, lest he should be killed. So here it's clear that Ramban critiques Abraham for what he did with Sarai. But he should have had faith that God would save him and his wife and all that he has, for God has the power to help and save. So what's Ramban's answer to what should Abraham do? Well, he should have faith. That is the Ramban's first critique, but it's not the only one. Look how he continues. Also, his departure from the land that he was initially commanded to go to because of the famine was a sin. For God in famine delivers from death. So what we can see here is that the Ramban attacks, critiques the patriarch on two fronts. One, how he treated Sarai, which he said led to a sinful situation where a married woman goes off to another man. And two, having departed the land of Israel, Canaan, he should have had faith in both instances. According to Ramban, he expects Abraham to have more faith and believe that God will help him out even in the troubled times in the land of Israel, and he should have stuck it out in Israel. So this is a quite forthright and powerful critique of the patriarch by one of the greatest of the rabbis of the Middle Ages, Nachmanides, Ramban, right? And by the way, it's characteristic of his interpretation. He doesn't spare critique of the heroes of the Bible, including the patriarchs, and where he thinks their behavior is worth condemnation, he says so. Now, that's already going quite far. But what's amazing is how he continues his interpretation. But before we read on, I'll ask you to consider for a minute or two parallels that you find between this short story that we just read and the famous story of the enslavement of the Israelites, right, in the land of Egypt, and the whole story of the Exodus, what's celebrated in Passover. In other words, the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus, the famous stories. Let's consider a comparison between the two. And I'd suggest you pause the recording and see how many parallels you could find between the two stories. So, after you gave some thought to that question, let's consider some parallels. For one, of course, both stories begin in a similar way. Namely, there is a famine that leads the people down to Egypt. Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt because of a famine, just like Jacob and his sons go down to Egypt because of famine towards the end of the book of Genesis. Interestingly, in both cases, in both stories, somebody from the family enters Pharaoh's house, right? In our story, it's Sarai. In the larger Exodus narrative, first it's Joseph, and later on it's Moses who enters the house of Pharaoh. It's not identical, of course, but it is a certain similarity. What's clear is also in both stories, Pharaoh and his household are afflicted by plagues. The word negaim appears in both stories. The Hebrew negaim here was translated as diseases, right? Plagues that afflict Pharaoh and his household in both stories. Interestingly enough, both stories end by the people being expelled, not only leaving, but being expelled, right? Pharaoh here expels Abraham and Sarai, and Pharaoh, after the plague of the firstborn, also goes out and tells Moses, "Kumu leave, get up and leave." Basically, they're being expelled, and that's why they have to rush out of Egypt, and they don't have time for their dough to rise, and therefore they have the matzot, right? And interestingly, in both stories, the departure is in great wealth. The Israelites left in great wealth because God commanded Moses to tell the people to take vessels from the Egyptians, and they leave with great wealth, just like Abraham left with great wealth and all the gifts he was given. So we have already quite a few parallels, quite striking parallels between the stories. Same language of negaim and same general plot line, if you will. But perhaps the most impressive connection is actually not a direct parallel, but a certain interrelationship between the two stories. And I'm referring to perhaps the most notorious of actions taken by the Egyptians when they afflicted and oppressed the poor Israelites in Egypt. And that is the horrific murder of the children of the Israelites. But what's interesting, if you recall, at the end of chapter 1 in Exodus, was who were murdered by the Egyptians. So the last verse in chapter 1 in Exodus was the command. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." So it was only the sons who were murdered, not the daughters, in the story of the oppression of the Israelites in the beginning of the book of Exodus. Why so? There's different explanations, homiletical interpretations that I don't think suit the shot that Pharaoh was aware that there would be a savior, a male savior, so he wanted to make sure that he would be killed. But I think the answer is a lot simpler. Pharaoh was indeed afraid of the males because they were, a threat in his eyes because of their great numbers, and he was afraid of a rebellion. So he decided to kill all the males. Why does he keep the females alive? Well, I think the answer is very simple. He planned to take them. So the Egyptians would benefit from the pretty Israelite woman that would be taken. Where do all these striking parallels between the stories bring the Ramban? So let us continue with the Ramban's interpretation, his conclusion. Look what he says, and this is going to knock you off your feet. And for this deed, his seed was exiled in the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh. In other words, because of these actions of Abraham, the two sins, according to Ramban of Abraham, the offspring of Abraham were exiled to the land of Egypt to Pharaoh. The place of punishment is the place where evil and sin were perpetrated. Do you gather what the Ramban is saying here? He's basically saying that all that occurred and transpired in Egypt, all the suffering and the oppression of the Israelites, is a direct outcome of Abraham's behavior in this very short narrative. Look what an impact this short narrative has on the continuing history of the Israelites. And the punishment is in the same location. Sin was perpetrated in Egypt, so the punishment is in Egypt. And we may add, what was the sin? Amongst others, it was basically willing to abandon your wife, right, or make use of your wife for your own safety. That's what Abraham did. He didn't want to risk his life, so he made Sarai pay the price, and therefore, what transpired to his offspring? Well, the males abandoned the female, right? So who will be punished? The males. The males are the ones who were thrown into the river. That is what the Ramban proposes, a very novel interpretation, a revolutionary interpretation, grappling with the big question, why all the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt later on? There's no clear and explicit reason given in the Bible. We see how things transpire, but it's not explicitly causal. We don't understand why things happen. We understand how they happen. We don't exactly understand the reasoning for how history developed. We know that there was a delay in the fulfillment of the promise of the land, but we don't know why the Israelites have to suffer in Egypt so much. And here, Ramban comes up with an answer. The answer is in our narrative. How did he think of such an idea? Well, I think he built off all the parallels that he noted. He wasn't the first to note the parallels. The sages already, the early sages already noted a lot of these parallels in the Midrash. But he takes it one step further and says, what's the reason behind these parallels? Well, it's to teach us that one event or one episode is directly related to the other, or one is even the cause of the other, according to Ramban. What is your opinion about this fascinating interpretation of the Ramban? Very, I'd say, courageous interpretation. So I'd ask you to contemplate it and consider, do you agree with the Ramban? Do you find his interpretation convincing? I'll present to you my position. On the one hand, I must say that I'm very impressed by the Ramban's courage and also his willingness to critique the patriarch. I appreciate that. Nobody is free of critique. And we know that a lot of the heroes, the biblical heroes, are critiqued by the prophets, right? And one of the aspects and characteristics that make the Bible so powerful and I think so ring of truth is that it is not an attempt simply to praise and elevate, right, certain heroes like other histories do. Rather, it is a very forthright and I'd say objective kind of description where even the greatest of heroes, King David, of course, and according to the Ramban, also Abraham in this case, and other characters whose flaws are shown, whether it be Joseph or even Moses, right, who ultimately doesn't enter the promised land because of certain failures. And we see that this is something that's very characteristic of biblical narrative. Nobody is beyond critique. So on that front, I think there's much to appreciate in Ramban's interpretation, which I think continues biblical tradition. However, the question is, does this interpretation really fit well with the text as we have it? So for one, I would say there's definitely no explicit sign in the narrative that God is angry. To the contrary, God comes out helping Abraham. If Abraham sinned, so why does he get off not only not being punished apparently, but rather even with a reward of great wealth, and he gets his wife back, everything's fine, and there's a very happy ending. If it's a story about sin, where is the punishment? So the punishment's delayed. Wait, why doesn't Abraham at least get rebuked? That's one problem I find in the Ramban's interpretation. But I also want to claim that I have a different understanding of the narrative. And in contrast to what I think almost all readers hold, that Abraham had a plan and it worked, I'm going to suggest here to the contrary. Abraham's plan actually failed. How do I make such a claim? Well, let's look once again carefully at the text. What was Abraham's plan and how did things progress? So, if I ask you, did Abraham give his wife to another man? Think before you answer. Let us take a look at the text. What happened here? Let's read verse 15. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, Sarai, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. I want to claim that this is a central point of the story. The text emphasizes Abraham did not give Sarai, rather, she was taken. And I think this hints to the failure of Abraham's plan. What was Abraham's plan? Abraham was indeed in a very desperate situation. There's no food, there's a famine in his land. He has no real choice but to go where there is food, but that entails danger. So his plan was to ask Sarai to present herself as his sister, not in order that he give her to somebody else, but rather being aware that people would be interested in her, and also that this may lead to his being murdered. He asked, present yourself as my sister. That will be beneficial for two reasons. It will save my life, but I'll also be able to benefit from it. How to benefit from it? I don't think he planned to give Sarai away, but he knew that if people would want Sarai, they would try to find favor in Abraham's eyes, who presents himself as the responsible brother here, the address, if for anyone who wants Sarai's hand, because people would assume her father must have passed away. So now the brother is the address, and they would come and offer presents, kind of like bribes, to find favor, right, in Abraham's eyes. And in my estimation, what Abraham was planning on doing was to, let's say, have people come. Let's say this rich Egyptian sheikh would come and say, "Hey, my son noticed Sarai. We hear she's your sister, and he's interested in her. So first, he would try to find favor in Abraham's eyes and say, please accept my presence on her behalf, and we would be very happy if you'll accept our proposal to have Sarai, your sister, marry my son." And Abraham, in light of his dire situation where he has no food and his life is in danger, he would probably have responded, "Thank you very much for your wonderful gifts. We appreciate them and accept them and are very gracious for your offer." And then he would say something like, "We have a couple of offers and we will consider it, and I'll speak to Sarai and we will get back to you shortly." And I think at a certain point, Abraham and Sarai will planned to just make a run for it and leave Egypt once they had enough food that they could survive the famine and return to Canaan. That was the plan. But in my opinion, that plan failed because the one thing Abraham didn't take into consideration, didn't dream would have happened. And that is, he didn't take into consideration the possibility that who would be interested in Sarai? The Pharaoh himself. Because how would Pharaoh know about Sarai? I mean, Abraham and Sarah are not walking around in the Pharaoh's castle or in the area there. So he didn't consider that as an option. But what happened in our story? Notice how the text emphasizes. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. What happened here? Pharaoh heard from his ministers that there was a beauty who came from the east. Of course, what does Pharaoh ask and inquire? Is she available? And the answer, yes, she came with her brother. Now, once there is an available woman and the king is interested, he doesn't have to ask any questions, right? It's good to be the king. And he takes her. That's what the text says. And she was taken into his palace. Very similar to what we read about Esther in the book of Esther, right? Vatilakach Esther. She was taken. Not that she was proposed by Mordechai, but rather she was taken. There's no choice. There's an available woman. They're taken by force for the king. And that's exactly what happened here. The plan failed. In my mind, Abraham had no intentions of giving Sarai over to anybody. He just wanted to be able to survive and get out with enough food. But Sarai was taken. And now Abraham's in dire straits because he doesn't have his sister wife, right? And here comes to the rescue, of course, God, who afflicts Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh returns Sarai and the wealth to Abraham. So, in my mind, I don't think Abraham wanted to give Sarai to anybody, and it's just that his plan failed because Pharaoh was the one who was interested in Sarai. One can still critique Abraham maybe for even leaving Canaan, but that, of course, would raise a very high level of expectation from the patriarch and place him in a position where he's supposed to be totally dependent upon miracles of God coming to his help. That's what the Ramban holds on that front as well. But one can counter and say a person can't count on miracles and has to act, right, to save himself. Abraham only wanted to temporarily go to Egypt until harm passes, and was planning definitely to return back to Canaan. So that we could leave open. We can appreciate the Ramban's high standard of faith, and he did live that way, and he himself came to Israel in difficult times. But on the other hand, we see also that Jacob goes down to Egypt, and I don't see any signs of Abraham being rebuked for having gone down, unless you say that the actual failure of Abraham's plan may itself be a punishment, which is, of course, also a viable option. So that's my reading of Abraham's and Sarai's going down to Egypt. Next time, we will pick it up from their return to the promised land.